All right, Rabbi, say good morning, good morning, good morning. It's incredible schos, Baruch Hashem, to take advantage of the legal holiday a little bit and to learn a little bit extra. I really want to give a very special thank you to Rabbi Shmuel Artman, who Baruch Hashem, suggested this a number of weeks ago and graciously agreed to go ahead and sponsor the breakfast. And then I want to thank Moshe Abramson, because originally I said no, because I figured, it's a short Friday, there's so much. And then Moshe said it to me again on Sunday or Monday. I said, okay, if this idea is coming from a couple of different places, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling us that we should try it. So Baruch Hashem, it's wonderful to sit with the Chaver and wonderful to be able to learn a little bit. And what I wanted to focus on, and really we're going to keep this a short shir this morning, because it still is a short Erev Shabbos. What I want to focus on is a really interesting concept that I think continuously comes up within the Gemara, which is Chazal legislate laws, right? Chazal have the power. The Torah gives them that power. Again, there's much, much more. The truth is, I'm thinking about this now. We may actually, maybe even continue this if this is convenient for everyone. Maybe we'll do this again next Friday, Meretz Hashem as well, because this topic is a massive topic. The real first part of the topic is, do Chazal have the right to legislate law? And under what circumstances do they have the right to do so? So the truth is, of course, the answer, do they have the right to legislate law? The answer to that, of course, is yes. Where do they get that right from? The Torah itself says, Lo saser min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin usmol. Do not veer from what they tell you right or left. And in fact, the Gemara says, Mikan, even if Chazal tell you that the right is left, the left is right, we have to listen to them. So Chazal are vested with an incredible amount of power to legislate law. Now, again, of course, the question is, well, who is Chazal? Which rabbinic bodies are vested with that ability? Again, our topics that we're not going to really cover today, but what we're going to focus on is that Chazal have this right. But we also notice something very interesting. I think this is kind of what the way the genesis of this, Reb Shmuel, when I spoke about this in passing a little bit, which is we see, let's say, throughout our journeys in Daf Yomi. So we see that there are times when Chazal make a law and they give the reason for that law. And sometimes the reason goes away and so does the law. And sometimes the reason doesn't go away and the law remains. So how exactly do we go ahead and explain that dynamic? So I want to share with you the Mara Makomos that I gave you today are actually a piece by Rav Hershel Schachter Shlita in his Sefer Eretz HaTzvi. So in Eretz HaTzvi, Rav Schachter goes through this topic in an exhaustive fashion. We're not going to go through the whole piece, but I just want to focus you on parts of it. So it's on page 1 in your handout, paragraph A. So here he's actually talking about the concept of davar shebeminyan tzarich minyan acher lahatiro, which is the concept that means that in general, when something is legislated by a Beis Din, it requires a Beis Din, a Jewish court, of at least equal number and wisdom to be able to revoke it. So look what Rav Schachter writes. He says, and now again, we're kind of picking up in the middle of a different topic that he's discussing, but we're going to isolate these ideas. Ubedas hageonim hayenir lomar deberov gezeras chazal matzinu shenigziru beofen shelo plug. They will say, in general, when Chazal legislate their laws, they generally institute it in a way that's called the low plug. Low plug means it applies across the board. In other words, we don't make, in truth, any legal system cannot legislate laws that are custom tailored to individuals. Right? The way a legal system works is you make a law, and the law applies to everyone, even if your personal circumstances may be a little bit different. So when Chazal institute their laws, they institute what we call a low plug. Low plug means no distinctions. He says, even if Chazal instituted their law for a particular reason, and for some reason the reason doesn't apply, the law still applies. So we'll say, here are competing values. When Chazal go ahead and make a takana, they make an enactment, so their enactment is generally made in what we call a low plug. No distinctions, it applies across the board. Yet, sometimes we find that when Chazal make a law for a particular reason, if the reason no longer applies, the takana falls off as well. So how do we reconcile these two things? It sounds like sometimes rabbinic law is immutable and irrevocable, and then at other times, when circumstances change, so does takanas chazal. So how do you reconcile those two things? So he says, for example, take a look at paragraph B. Shetamid, kishetiknu chazal ezo takanos shegzar ezo gzera haya lahem tam gadol b'siba chashuva. So this is incredible. Rav Shechter says, first you have to understand something. Whenever the rabbis legislated law, they only legislate when there is an absolute necessity. Listen to this. Because Rav Shechter posits, in unnecessary rabbinic legislation is actually a rabbinic prohibition. What rabbinic prohibition? The prohibition of Bal Tosif. The Torah tells us that we're not allowed to add on to the mitzvos. So I can't go ahead and say the classic example, I have 4 compartments in my tefillin, I'd love to have 5 compartments in my tefillin. I'm not allowed to do that. That's the Isra of Bal Tosif, right? I want to add roses and tulips to my Daled Minim. I don't just like Hadassim and Aravas. I like a little bit of color, right? So I'd like to add that in. You can't do that. That's Bal Tosif. So Rav Shechter says something amazing. How Chazal are able to add on to mitzvos? Effectively, we do that. We have a whole body of rabbinic law. The rabbis are only permitted to add on rabbinic law when they feel that it serves an absolute necessity. It has to serve a purpose. It has to serve a real reason. If it's unnecessary, then it's Bal Tosef. Paragraph C. So we'll skip a little bit. He says, look at the last line of the paragraph C. Paragraph D. Berov pamim lo echnisu hachachamim estam hagzera l'soch etzem nusach hagzera. Or mir tamakarim nischu es gzerasam lomar shedavar ploni aser machmas chashash amoni. So here's what's interesting. So Rav Shechter points out, however, there are 2 different types of rabbinic prohibitions, 2 types of rabbinic gzeros. There are times when Chazal went ahead and told us why they're doing what they're doing. And there are times that they did not necessarily tell us why they're doing what they're doing. What's a good example of when Chazal told us why they're doing what they're doing? We just had in Daf Yomi not so long ago. All right, Tudei Yom Tov. Right, Tudei Yom Tov is a perfect example. Good. Another one, a little more recent. We'll actually come back to this. Gzeira D'Rabba. Gzeira D'Rabba. We won't blow shofar. We won't go ahead and read Megillah on Shabbos. Because Gzeira Shema Ya'avirena Dala Amut L'Shus Harabim. Because you might come to carry the Megillah, might come to carry the shofar. So again, there are times Chazal told us you can't do things, and they tell us why you can't. What's a good example of a takana where Chazal did not tell us why they're legislating? Give you a good example. Kalisha. Right? Kalisha is a rabbinic prohibition to hear a woman sing. Right? Again, I'm simplifying it. Chazal did not explicitly say why that's usher. Now again, intuitively, right? We glean our ideas, but just pointing out, like in the formulation of the halacha, Chazal did not articulate an explicit reason. Now you could say, maybe because it was, it doesn't matter why they didn't. The point is they didn't. So if Shechter points out, you see 2 different types of rabbinic enactments. Times when the rabbis made the takana, they told us, Rabbah tells us, you cannot blow the shofar on Shabbos. You cannot take lulav and esrog on Shabbos. You can't even Megillah on Shabbos. I'm going to tell you why. We're afraid you're going to carry. And then many other times where the rabbi said, you can't do this, but did not espouse a reason. So Rav Shechter says something absolutely amazing. He explains, I'm going to skip a little bit because he gets into over here a whole, I gave you this whole piece because I think it's worthwhile reading, and it's worthwhile learning, and I think it's incredibly profound. So if you skip a little bit, go to paragraph I. So here, this is Rav Shechter's primary thesis. He says, V'hine kaimalam b'nogea l'gzeras d'Rabbanan. So all right, let me tell you the piece that I skipped outside. There is an interesting machlokes when it comes to biblical law of what we call darshinan taimid dikra. Do we look for the reasons in mitzvos or not? Do we look for the reasons in mitzvos? And I will say this is a fundamental machlokes. And often, looking for reasons or not looking for reasons could go ahead and yield an interesting decision. I'll give you the paradigmatic example. The Torah says, Lo sachbo beged almana. You cannot take collateral from a widow. You can't take collateral from a widow. Now, why does the Torah tell you you can't take collateral from a widow? What do you think? I know, see, no one's used to interactive shiurim anymore, right? I know, I'm sorry. I've ruined this, right? Why does the Torah tell you you're not supposed to take collateral from a widow? What do you think? Vulnerable. She needs it. So the Gemara says, what about an almana? What about a rich widow? What about a very wealthy widow? Are you allowed to go ahead and take collateral from a wealthy widow? We'll say, what's the answer? The answer is, it depends, right? Do you look for the reasons behind mitzvos or not? If you look for the reasons behind mitzvos, the reason the Torah tells me not to take collateral from a widow is because the assumption is that a widow is vulnerable, a widow is compromised. So again, the Torah says, don't make her life more difficult. That's if you look for the reasons. But maybe if you don't look for reasons, the Torah says, don't take collateral from a widow. We don't look at our bank statements, right? We don't know if she's wealthy or not wealthy. The Torah says, don't do it. So I don't do it. So I'll say, how do we paskin? Do we look for reasons for mitzvahs or not? And the answer is, right? Good. It depends. So essentially, what we do is as follows. When the Torah gives me a reason, then the halacha takes the reason into account. When the Torah doesn't give me a reason, then we do not paskin halacha based on supposed reasons behind mitzvos. So for example, when it comes to beged almana, right, the Torah says don't take collateral from an almana. Torah doesn't tell me why. So because the Torah doesn't tell me why, I just take that as a blanket law. A blanket law, right? That halacha l'maisa, I am not allowed to go ahead and take collateral from a widow. She's wealthy, she's impoverished. Torah doesn't give me a reason. But there are other times when the Torah does give me a reason. For example, the Torah says that the king, lo yarbe lo susim, he's not allowed to marry too many wives. He's not allowed to have too many horses. Why? What's the concern? Shema yasser levavo, perhaps they'll turn his heart. Perhaps he'll go back down to Egypt. So there, interestingly enough, the halacha takes into account the reasoning behind the mitzvah as well. So just keep that in mind. So normally, when somebody asks, darshinan time with dikra, or lo darshinan time with dikra, do we look for the reasons behind mitzvahs or not? The answer really is, it depends. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives me the reason for the mitzvah, then the reason could play a role in the creation or the formulation of halachic policy around the mitzvah. But if the Torah does not give me the reason for the mitzvah, I might have a million reasons in my mind, right? And remember again, like the Sefer HaChinuch advances reasons for mitzvos. But at the end of the day, if the Torah doesn't give me the reason, then the reason does not play a role in the formulation of halacha. Now, why is this important? Rav Shechter posits that rabbinic law follows the same exact model. Take a look at paragraph I. V'hakanami b'nogay l'gzeros d'Rabbanan dibevadai kol gzer nigzra pitamim chashuvim v'chashashos chazakos. Like we just said before, Chazal have to have a reason when they legislate law, right? You can't just legislate for the sake of legislation. Why do they have to have a reason? If they don't have a reason, then what do we run into? Baal Tosif. Then it's adding on to the Torah. So we know Chazal always have a reason. Achein birov pamim shelo hechnisu es tam hagzera el toch nosach hagzera. But more often than not, the rabbis did not include the reasoning in the initial text or in the initial formulation of the law. B'chiyai gavna shayeches hagzera afilu b'mikra shelo shayech hatam. Uba'osam hamekarim shechnisu es tam hagzera el toch nosach hagzera. As I called the tikkun rabbanan came the araisa tikkun. So let's listen to this. See, in Rav Shechter posits, rabbinic law follows the same model as biblical law. Just like biblical law, if there's no reason, right stated, the law applies across the board. If there is a reason stated, you can take into account the reason in the creation of halachic policy around that law. In rabbinic law, this is the same. When Chazal did not include the reasoning for their enactment, even if we know the reasoning, right? I know the reasoning. But they did not include it in their enactment, then ultimately, even if the reason falls off, the legislation remains. However, when Chazal built in the reasoning into the formulation of the law, then in that case, what they're telling us is what? What are they telling us? The law only applies as long as the reason is intact. But should the reason fall away, should the reason no longer be a concern, the law automatically falls away as well. So both say this is, Adam, what are you going to say? Oh, good. Hold on, Sam, for just a bit. Hold on. We're gonna see how to plug this in right now. What's amazing is Rav Schechter is creating what is a very dramatic, we'll call it legal and also theological construct. That essentially there are two different types of rabbinic laws. There are rabbinic laws. So I just want to be clear. Don't confuse knowing the reason for something versus Chazal stating the reason for something. Rav Schechter says that is no longer needed and falls off. However, if they legislate the law and no reason is explicitly stated, even though I know the reason, we know the reason, but if it's not explicitly stated in the formulation, their intention is for that law to remain on the books, even should the reason fall away. And he goes on, he says, this in paragraph J, he adds in one very important piece. I will say there's another concept of davar shebeminyan, tzarich minyan acher lahatiro. That when something is created by a particular rabbinic body, how does revocation of rabbinic law work? How does it work? Another rabbinic body of at least equal, if not larger, number and wisdom has to come back to repeal it. Rav Schechter says that's only true when Chazal did not give a reason for their law. If they gave a reason, if the reason no longer applies, the law falls off. The law falls off even without any specific revocation process. Yes?
The 2-day Yantif, wasn't there a reason given?
Absolutely. No, because remember again, there's a follow-up there. The Gemara says, even though the reason no longer applies. Remember, we'll say, what did the Gemara say? Little Chazara? No. I mean, that's a good answer, but no. Right? Shemeyachzir hadavar lekilkulo. There's a concern. I tell them not to be shy. You guys should really just sit next to each other. I feel like you sprain your neck a lot. All right? So ultimately, again, the Gemara says, what are we concerned about? Shemeyachzir hadavar lekilkulo. We're concerned that ultimately, again, there may be future forces that would mess with the calendar and mess things up for second day Yontif. So this is a very important point. So I'll say second day Yontif is a perfect example. Chazal told us you have to keep a second day of Yontif in the diaspora. Why? Let's go through this. Why? Because there was calendrical ambiguity. Well, there's no longer calendrical ambiguity. We know exactly when Yom Tov is. So based on what Rav Schechter is saying, there should no longer be second day Yom Tov in the diaspora. But remember, the reason why it's a good example, but it's not a good example, is because the rabbis proactively addressed it. And they said, we realize that the original reason for our enactment no longer applies, but we're giving you now another reason to keep it. And the other reason to keep it is lest things go back to what they were. Because historically, Gentile forces have always tried to mess with the calendar. Right? So there's a concern of tampering with the calendar, in which case, once again, calendrical ambiguity. We did it, right? Remember we did this? So you have to work on yourself. Never say it doesn't make any sense to me, right? So remember again, if you look at Jewish history, one of the ways that people have constantly tried to assimilate the Jewish people is by tampering with the Jewish calendar, because we count time in a different way. Chazal were concerned, they understood that there are generations of persecution ahead of us, and in order to safeguard Yom Tovim and the calendar, they said, keep the second day Yom Tov in the diaspora. So it was really a proactive measure to ensure that nothing ever happens to our system of Yom Tovim. One could say that perhaps Chazal were being a little bit too careful. It's possible that they were being exceptionally vigilant. So again, a good example, original reason falls away, but at the end of the day, a secondary reason keeps the takana in place.
People of the same generation that enacted the reason to keep it in place?
No, different generation, and that's a good example of a davar shebeminyan tzarich minyan acher la'atiro. There had to be a second it was not. I don't know how many generations apart it was, but it was not the same generation. That is correct.
Remote possibility. You mess with the atomic clock of Boulder, Colorado, over many, many years, which keeps the calendar. So you're slowly shifting days, second by second.
Right. Well, again, even in the lunar, even in the solar calendar, the solar calendar is not accurate, right? But I'm saying nothing to do with the Boulder clock. The church chopped off a whole bunch of years. Right? This is a whole sichsuch, right? This is a whole discussion in terms of the 2022. Right, the church fast forwarded the calendar by a number. I don't remember the whole historical piece with this, but there's no question that time as we have it is not an accurate portrayal, even from this is Mamish and Yonah Dioma, right? Right, even from the birth of Yashka, it's not right. It's not accurate. It's not accurate. Good, Mamish. Okay, so listen to this. So therefore again in paragraph J he explains that halacha l'maisa. Even the concept of needing a rabbinic body of greater number and wisdom is only when there's not a reason associated with the law. Because if there's a reason, and the reason no longer applies, then what happens to the law? It simply slips off the books. There is no additional process that's necessary. Now, one more piece, paragraph K. Dafka b'shar gzeras da'alma Haisa habrera biyat chazal o ligzar gzera benusach stami o lichlal tam hagzera el toch nusach hagzera. The Rabbi will say, watch this. Here, if Schechter says something amazing, I'm sure this will address the gzera de Rabbi. Watch this. So now, Adam. Right, gzera de Rabbi. So we'll say, so now watch this. So now, if Schechter says this idea that the rabbis have the license to include the reasoning or not include the reasoning, that only applies in pure rabbinic legislation. But when the rabbis introduce legislation that uproots biblical law, they must include the reasoning. So Rabbi says, so anytime Chazal are stepping in and telling you not to do a mitzvah, they must tell you why they're telling you to do that. The paradigmatic example of that, Gezerah de Rabbah. Right? Gezerah de Rabbah, Rabbah tells us don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah, don't read the Megillah, don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah that falls out on Shabbos, don't read the Megillah on Purim that falls out on Shabbos, don't take lulav and esrog on Sukkot that falls out on Shabbos, and there they say why? Gezerah Shema Ya'avirenu Dalet Amos Birshus Harabim. And Rav Schechter says, Chazal have no choice. When they are uprooting biblical law, they must include their reasoning. Yes?
Sorry, I'm not going to, this is my last question.
I don't believe you, by the way. I don't believe you.
Chicken and cheese. That he gave, wasn't that Red Gershman?
No, it was already the Gemara. Ofen Chalav.
That's rabbinic?
That's rabbinic. That's rabbinic.
Did they give a reason?
Sure, that's a safeguard. That's a safeguard for meat and milk. Right? So, but again, that reason still applies. In other words, people very often include fowl in the same category as meat. So if we're permissive with chicken and milk, the concern of being permissive with meat and milk absolutely still applies. Right? So in other words, I just want to be clear, there are many times Chazal give a reason, remember again, but the reason still applies. That's an excellent example. Right here, Chazal are telling us, don't eat ofen chalav, don't eat fowl and milk. Right? Why? It's a safeguard. The Gemara says, already in the Gemara, Maseches Chulin, the Gemara says because people interchange fowl, meat very easily, and if you eat fowl and milk, you'll come to eat meat and milk. So here, they said a reason, but again, the reason still applies. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, the halacha is still on the books. So I will say, so now let's take this and begin to plug this in and just into some examples, just for another few minutes, then we'll stop. So I'll just point out a couple of things. So remember, Rav Schechter gives us this construct, right? The construct being two levels of rabbinic law. Rabbinic law that comes with an articulated reason, rabbinic law without an articulated reason. Why do Chazal sometimes articulate their reasons, sometimes not articulate their reasons? What's the reason for the distinction? Because they want us to understand when they articulate a reason, they're saying to us, the halacha only applies when the reason applies. But should the reason disappear, the halacha falls off. What mechanism do you need to remove the halacha after the reason falls off? What mechanism? None at all. It just simply slips away. Right? It just simply slips off the books. But when there is no articulated reason, then ultimately, again, that halacha remains on the books, even if the perceived reason no longer applies. Just to understand, where's Rav Schechter getting this model from? He's really taking it from biblical law. When the Torah sometimes gives me a reason for a mitzvah, doesn't give me a reason for the mitzvah. When it gives me a reason for the mitzvah, halachic policy takes into account that reason. When it doesn't give me a reason, halachic policy doesn't take into account the reason. One more piece, whenever rabbis are uprooting rabbinic biblical law, they must give a reason for their particular enactment. So we'll say, I'll give you just some examples of this. Except when the Torah gives us a reason. In general, we paskin lo darshin and time dekra, that when the Torah does not give me a reason, I don't describe a reason. But where the Torah does give me a reason, we paskin darshin and time dekra. So I will say some examples of this. I didn't put this on the sheets, but it was just about outside. Mashkin shenis galu. We'll say there's a halach in the Gemara that says that if you leave liquids uncovered overnight, you are not permitted to drink them. And in fact, this halacha is actually codified in Shulchan Aruch. Mashkin shenes galu, if you left liquids open, uncovered overnight, asru chachamim. Chazal said you're not allowed to drink that liquid. So again, I will say a very simple idea. You leave a cup of water on your night table overnight, right? Maybe you wake up, you get thirsty, right? You leave a cup of water on your night table overnight. The halacha as expressed in the Gemara is, you're not allowed to drink that. You're not allowed to drink that. What's the concern? What's the concern? Shchaishinon shema shasa nachash mehen vehitil bahem eres. Chazal said, what's the concern? Snakes. A snake may come, inject its venom, and chas v'shalom it could be sakana. Shulchan Aruch says, va'achshav she'ein nachashim mitzuyim beinenu mutter. And now that we no longer live amongst snakes, or snakes no longer live amongst us, right? We don't live in places that are heavily populated by snakes, or at least what we'll call venomous snakes. Venomous snakes, therefore halacha l'maisa, it's mutter. And that's why halacha l'maisa, if you want to leave an uncovered cup of water on your night table overnight, you are permitted to drink it the next night. One second. How does that work? The Chazal says, we'll say now it all makes sense. Why? Because when Chazal created this legislation of mashkin shenes galu, uncovered liquids, what did they do? They gave the reason. This is not esoteric, right? This is very practical, and they're including the reason ultimately, again, in their legislation. The reason is gone, and therefore, again, the halacha simply slips off the book. So again, I quoted for you Shulchan Aruch, Yaradea, Siman Kuf Tes Zayin Sif Aleph. See, here you find something amazing. Shulchan Aruch quotes the halacha and then tells us it no longer applies. Yes, Ilan.
But in certain geographic locations, like if you was in Australia, where there are venomous snakes that are still prevalent, or in India, would there be different geographic considerations?
So this is what's interesting. So remember again, this goes back to kind of remember the low plug idea, that whenever the rabbis make their law, they always make it in a blanket approach. So in general, once you're going to say that for the majority of people, this no longer applies, it no longer applies. Now, is it a good idea, right? If you're a Jew in Australia, Jew in India, probably. But the halacha, technically speaking, and again, it's very important. Halacha, remember, there's no piece of legislation that applies equally to every single person, right? That's why Rav Schechter introduced this, and he said, Chazal institute in a low plug, across the board. Wait, I'll give you another example of this, which is actually quite interesting. The halacha of not eating fish and meat together, right? Not allowed to eat fish and meat together. So we'll say, here's again, the Shulchan Aruch says, first I'll mention, here, we'll just read you the Shulchan Aruch. This again is in Yaradea, Kuf Tes Zayin Sif Beis. Siman Kuf Tes Zayin, so they have all of these good halachas regarding these enactments of Chazal about what you're allowed to eat, not allowed to eat. So listen to this. Shulchan Aruch says, Tzarech lizar, shelo le'echol basar v'dag biyachad. You cannot eat fish and meat together. You can't eat fish and meat together. Why? Mipnei shekasha litzaraas. The Gemara says, why can't you eat fish and meat together? Because it causes saras. Saras literally is translated as leprosy, right? So whether it's literal leprosy or sickness, you can't eat fish and meat together because it causes sickness. Not only that, by the way, the Ramah says, really, ein litzlos basar im dag. You really should not even roast fish and meat together, mishum reicha, because even the reach, right, even the scent, the aroma, is detrimental, right? That's why, again, person's cooking fish and meat in the same oven, they should be covered. Person wants to use a grill for fish and for meat, they really should be kashered in between use. Mihu B'di evet eno aser. However, the Ramah says if you ended up cooking fish and meat together in the same oven, it's not aser, right? B'di evet, it's not aser. So I will say here we have a fascinating example, right? So you're not allowed to eat fish and meat together, and Chazal told us, why can't you eat fish and meat together? It causes illness. What's the kasha? What's the question? Right. It doesn't seem to cause illness, right? People eat fish and meat together all of the time, right? And they're just fine. They're just fine. So now, what do I do with this halacha? So interestingly enough, I'll say the Aruch HaShulchan writes, he says as follows. He says that he gives a whole explanation of this as to why it's possible that once upon a time, fish and meat together really posed a health risk, and contemporarily they do not. You know, there's a lot of actually literature about this, about potentially having to do with mercury levels in fish during Talmudic times, different things. Aruch HaShulchan said that very often people would eat fish much later. In other words, that by the time that we would already consider things to be already like a shtickle, what do they call it, spoiled, rotten, it was common to go ahead and eat that. So he says that combination, he gives a whole bunch of reasons. But bottom line, he says, one thing is clear, which is, it doesn't apply today, right? But yet the halacha of eating fish and meat today absolutely does apply today. So now we have a problem, because we just got finished saying that whenever the rabbis give a reason for their enactment, and the reason no longer applies, then what? The enactment simply falls away. We bolster that, mashkim shenes galu, right? We saw an example of that. Shabbos says, so halacha lemaisa, along the same lines, fish and meat should no longer apply, because halacha lemaisa, it doesn't cause saras. So I will say here, each of the Aruch HaShulchan quotes the Gemara that says, Gemara Maseches Chulin, Chamira sakanta meisura. There is an exception to the rule. What's the exception to the rule? When Chazal legislated something because of sakana, because of danger, that rule remains on the books, even if the sakana, the danger, is no longer there. Now, you're going to think to yourself, 1 second, that doesn't make sense. What did we just say before? Right? Snakes. Shabbos says, so it must be, and this is fascinating, it must be that there are different levels of danger. Right? Even when Chazal went ahead and instituted the mashkim shenes galu, the whole snake thing, it wasn't the pshat that everybody's living amongst poisonous snakes. It was enough of a danger for them to legislate. But it's not a high enough level of danger to remain on the books when the primary reason falls off. But the fish meat thing apparently posed such a prevalent danger that even though contemporarily that danger no longer applies, the rule still remains on the books. So Rabbi say, you see something fascinating. So even though we just said before that whenever Chazal espoused the reason, if the reason goes away, the takana goes away as well. The exception to that is when they legislated because of sakana, because of danger. If it's because of danger, the rule remains there. Even if they legislated because of prevalent danger, then the rule remains, even if the danger goes away. But let's say I'll conclude with one last piece. The Ber Halacha, this is incredible. The Ber Halacha, this is in Hilchos Shabbos, Siman Shin Gimel. Siman Shin Gimel, it's the Ber Halacha in Os Yud Ches. So look what he writes. He says something amazing. V'yesh la'ayin l'shita zu. So to give you the context, Shulchan Aruch is talking about the definition of a Reshus Harabim, public domain. But let's say, what's the definition of Reshus Harabim? We learn this in Daf Yomi. We learn everything in Daf Yomi. It's incredible. It's like one-stop shopping, everything you want. And if you add in there Mishnah Yomi, it's ridiculous. So let's say, now listen to this. So what's the definition of Reshus Harabim? Reshus Harabim has two criteria. Number one, width, and number two, pedestrian traffic. Width is Tez Zayin Amos, 16 Amos. 16 Amos across. So again, if you imagine that an Amma is 1.5 feet, so what's 16 Amos? 40 feet? 24, sorry. Right, sorry, I left the counting. Yeah, sorry, it's good. So it's right, 24 Amos across. I'm sorry, 24 feet across. So let's call it 25 feet across. So it has to be at least the width of 25 feet and 600,000 people walking there per day, right? So the Ber Halacha says, the truth is, you almost never find a Reshus Harabim D'oraisa. And I will say, by the way, except in New York, right? In New York, Ocean Parkway, you have this, right? So I will say, why is this? But this is very important for us because the absence of a biblical Rosh Hashanah allows us to do what? Put up an Eruv. Remember, an Eruv will not work in a biblical Rosh Hashanah. This is why there's so much contention and machlokes about the Eruv in Flatbush, right? So again, or the Eruv in Manhattan, right? There's so much machlokes about it because there you're dealing with biblical public domains, right? Let's say in Baltimore, right? Again, there's an issue with the Beltway. There's an issue with the Beltway, which is a potential issue in extending the Eruv out. But at the end of the day, all of our areas over here, even what we would consider to be Reisterstown Road, Park Heights, again, these do not satisfy the criteria of biblical Rosh Hashanah. So I will say, listen to what the Ber Halacha says. He says, I don't understand. According to this opinion, that the truth is, a biblical Rosh Hashanah requires the particular width and the pedestrian traffic of 600,000, which means you virtually never have a biblical Rosh Hashanah. Lama ein token shofar b'Rosh Hashanah b'Shabbos bizmanenu. He says, why don't we blow shofar on Shabbos contemporarily? Kevan deleka Rosh Hashanah the lo shayach shema ya'avirenu dalet amos. What a kasha. What a kasha. So Rabbi said, this is now all of our worlds colliding together. So the Ber Halacha, by the way, you see, by the way, Rav Schachter is not the first person to espouse this shita. In other words, the Ber Halacha is coming from the perspective like this. Why don't I blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah? Oh, sorry. Why don't I blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah that falls out on Shabbos? Why not? Why not? Gzeira de Rabbah. Rabbah came along with his base in rabbinic legislation. We don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah that falls out on Shabbos, lest you come to go ahead and carry it, Dalit Amos, in a public domain. Great. We'll say, what type of rabbinic enactment is that? What type of rabbinic enactment? Right? Reason. What happens when you have a rabbinic enactment with a reason? The reason falls away, then what? Then what? Then so does the enactment. If that's the case, says the Ber Halacha, we should blow shofar on Shabbos today. We should blow shofar on Shabbos. There's no real biblical Rosh Hashanah. We should blow shofar. Rabbi say, how does the Ber Halacha end? He says, Tzarechiyim. I don't know why we don't blow shofar today on Shabbos. Wild. But Rav Schachter answered. Rabbi say, because you remember again, Rav Schachter explained, now you can answer the Ber Halacha. How can you answer the Ber Halacha? Why don't we blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah even today, even though the reason is no longer applicable? Why not? Because remember again, when it comes to uprooting biblical law, the rabbis have to give a reason. The inclusion of a reason by rabbinic legislation that uproots biblical law has nothing to do with the previous paradigm. Shabbosai, since Rav Schachter, we have two paradigms. There are two constructs. There's typical rabbinic law. Typical rabbinic law, which usually comes in the form of additional legislation, right? There are legislation the Torah did not. In that realm, there are two ways to formulate that law. You can formulate it with a reason, without a reason. If you formulate it without a reason, it's on the books until another rabbinic body of equal number of wisdom comes along and repeals it. If you go ahead and you give it with a reason, then halacha l'maisa, if the reason falls away, then what? The rule falls away as well. There's another construct. And the other construct is when the rabbis legislate rabbinic law that uproots biblical law. In that case, they must include a reason. But why? Because without a reason, then what? You don't have a right to uproot biblical law. They have to include a reason. But the inclusion of a reason by rabbinic law that uproots biblical law does not put that law into the category of typical rabbinic law that has a reason. That rabbinic law that uproots biblical law must have a stated reason in order for Chazal to have the license. But that doesn't make it into the type of takana that if the reason goes away, so the takana goes away as well. So it turns out that there are really three categories of rabbinic. So I will say, therefore, again, I'm sorry, before I get to that, that's the answer to the Ber Halacha. See, the Ber Halacha, this is fascinating, the Ber Halacha looked at Gezeira de Rabbah as a typical rabbinic law that has a reason. So if the reason is gone, the law should fall away as well. But what he didn't understand, and what Rav Schachter articulated, was that no, this is a separate category. When rabbinic law uproots biblical law, you have to give a reason for that. And the inclusion of a reason in that type of law does not automatically lump it with general rabbinic law that has a stated reason that falls away if the reason goes away. As soon as it's about biblical law, the reason must be there, but that law remains on the books until when? Until when? Until a subsequent rabbinic body comes along and repeals it. So it turns out, Rabbi said that in Dinei D'Rabbanan, we actually have 3 categories of halachas. So category 1 is Chazal legislating additional laws without a reason. Right? If they write laws without a reason, then what's the halacha? What's its legal status? Remains until when? Right? Until a subsequent rabbinic body of greater number and wisdom comes and would want to repeal it. Category 1. Category 2, Chazal go ahead and include a reason for their law. What's the status of that law? Reason falls away, then what? Law falls away, except sakana. Right? Except when they legislated something because of prevalent danger. And category number 3 is Chazal instituting rabbinic law in order to uproot biblical law. The paradigmatic example, I said there are a couple of examples like that. We also saw it, by the way, by Hashavas Aveda Zakin ve'enu lefi kavodo, that although you're not normally allowed to look away from a lost object, if someone finds a lost object and it's beneath their dignity to take the object, they're allowed to look away. So Chazal are able to legislate uprooting biblical law. As an aside, by the way, the only time Chazal could uproot biblical law is when? With a shave v'al tasa. Right? Chazal could uproot biblical law by telling you not to do something. They cannot uproot biblical law by telling you to what? To do something illegal. Very, very important distinction. But in any event, when Chazal legislate to go and uproot biblical law, then what's the halacha? What's the halacha? They must include a reason, for that's the reason for that they allow uprooting a biblical law to begin with. But the inclusion of a reason does not subject that particular law to the normal methodology or procedures of rabbinic law with an included reason, which means that when Chazal institute rabbinic law to uproot biblical law, even though they set a reason, just because the reason falls away does not automatically mean that the halacha falls away. B'haraya, even though today we really don't have rishuyos harabim d'oraisa, and therefore, technically speaking, you should be able to blow the shofar on Shabbos, take your lulav and esrog, read the Megillah. Halacha l'maaseh, that law will remain on the books until a Beis Din of larger number and wisdom comes and repeals it. Yes? Say that once. Did they? Right. Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if there was. I mean, it seems to be, when you look at halakhic literature, it seems to be such a rarity, right? That amount of pedestrian traffic and that width. I don't know. I don't know if in Surah Pumpadisa. Right. Yeah, I don't know. Right. That would be an interesting point, right? If he made it even with Rosh Hashanah Daraisa. I don't know. Yeah, excellent point. So remember, there are other types of rabbinic enactments which we're not getting into right now, which is what's called, for example, I'm just pointing out, is a hora'ah shah. Hora'ah shah is that sometimes Chazal will allow you to do something that is actually normally illegal, and normally prohibited in an extenuating or desperate circumstance. So correct. Maybe we'll do that next week, Emir Hashem, because there's a number of fascinating examples of that as well. But right, we are not addressing that at all. Shmuel.
Swimming a chance to build a ramp, but we're allowed to, because we're not professionals, we're not the build a ramp, we're allowed to clap our hands in chance.
Right. So right. So once we get into the weeds, what I didn't get into, by the way, I wasn't thinking about swimming. The truth is, this also comes up, is medicine on Shabbos. Right? Taking medicine on Shabbos is like a big discussion about this, because there, Chazal said the reason you can't take medicine on Shabbos is why? Schikas samani may come to grind. Many people can bring down, nobody knows how to make their own medicine, right? Or whatever you're usually grinding for yourself is usually illegal anyway. You know what I'm saying? So, so again, yeah, maybe, maybe what we'll do is maybe we'll continue this topic into next week as well, getting into some of the more practical examples. And then again, even there, we'll get into the distinction between medicine and vitamins. Swimming is going to be another great example. Clapping, right? Chazal saying not allowed to clap on Shabbos because Shema Yitaken Klei Shir. Again, All right, you know what? Meretz Hashem, next week we'll continue with examples of this and kind of drill down. And we'll see, by the way, as we go into the examples, we'll begin to see even more exceptions to these rules as well. Jacob, you had a question?
Given that a lot of these funds were made back in time of Chazal, and the only way to uproot them is with a basin of greater number and greater wisdom, I'm assuming that today it's just not possible.
Look, number you could get. Number is never a problem. Wisdom, it's always complicated to understand how you gauge wisdom. Could you assemble a body like this? I have no doubt you can. But what it would require is unity in Am Yisrael. You know what I'm saying? What you're talking about is bridging everyone together and essentially forming a Sanhedrin. Right? There have been attempts over the years to forge a Sanhedrin. I don't think the problem is number, and the problem is not even wisdom. There are many, many, many great minds in Klal Yisrael. The problem or the challenge seems to be one of Achdus. Right? If we can get a Sanhedrin together, there are many things that we could accomplish on behalf of Klal Yisrael. It would be incredible. So I don't think it's an impossibility. It may be impractical until Mashiach comes, but certainly not impossible. Because rabbinic law is always modeled after rabbinic law. Called the Tukan Rabbanon Ke'in Da'araisa Tikkun. The Gemara tells us, where did the rabbis model their legal system after? Or where do they model it from? How do you know what the construct is? Rabbinic law always mirrors biblical law in its form and in its substance. Because more often than not, the role of rabbinic law is to bolster biblical law. That's all. It's not like a separate independent legal system. It's an appendage of biblical law. Right? Kadosh Baruch Hu vests Chazal with the power, and Chazal's job is bolster the biblical system. So any rabbinic legal system will always mirror the biblical one. Well, it's not for granted. It's understood in the license for the rabbis to legislate law. In other words, why do they have that right to legislate law? That right derives from a desire to sustain biblical law. So it makes sense that whatever rules govern biblical law, govern rabbinic law. You know, you're asking, like, is there a specific source for that? I don't know. I'd have to. Clearly, you see, like Rav Shechter's taking that, for granted that it mirrors. I don't know if there's a source for it. I'd have to look. I'm sorry. You can't add, but in other words, but how does that mean? Jesse's saying, like, how do you know that means that the mechanism for establishing rabbinic law is the same? Because again, you're focusing on the idea of time and dekra. The reason, yeah. So I don't know. I think to me it just sounds intuitive, but I could look if there's a source for it. I don't know offhand.
Assume that talking about it, the directive is specifically dealt with biblical law. I mean, secondary, you have to technically fall into that category if it results in not putting on.
But I feel correct.
Not directed.
That is correct. There's a tension there, and the tension there is preservation of Yom Tiv, but a side effect of that is putting on tefillin. There's a whole discussion amongst the Rishonim, some actually discussing whether or not one should put on tefillin on Yom Tov Sheni. The reason we don't do it is because it's understood if you put on tefillin on Yom Tov Sheni, you totally undermine the whole system of Yom Tov Sheni. But it's not as opposed to Gzera D'Rabba, where the intended consequence is to uproot biblical law, by second day Yom Tov is kind of just a secondary or incidental impact. All right, yes. So this is a big discussion. So the answer is the prohibition is biblical. Now, again, the prohibition is mentioned two places, both by individuals, but primarily by the king. Right? The Torah says that the king should not buy too many horses, should not have too many horses, because ultimately, again, horses, I guess in biblical times, primarily came from Egypt. So it is a biblical prohibition. Now, there's an incredible amount of rabbinic literature about when does it apply, to whom does it apply. The Rambam lived in Egypt. Many great people lived in Egypt. There was a massive community in Alexandria. The Gemara itself talks about, we just had this, right? The Beis HaMikdash of Chanyo was in Alexandria. The great shuls of Alexandria, where the Gemara brings in as an example. I remember again, but from Sukkah, The shuls were so big that the guy had to stand there with the flag, telling everybody when stands Baruch Hu Baruch Shmo and Amen. Complicated discussion. So some saying ultimately the biblical prohibition is only to literally retrace the steps of the Jews back through the Sinai Desert to Egypt. Others saying that again, perhaps it's only a prohibition for the king, not for other people. Major machlokes. Right, Chavra, we'll stop over here for today. We will continue Yetz Hashem next Friday, and what we'll do is I think we're going to stay with this topic. I think next week, right? Is next Friday the legal holiday also? Good. So we'll continue next Friday. Yetz Hashem. What we'll do is we'll focus on examples. So we'll cover swimming. We'll cover Yetz Hashem medicines. I don't know anything else anyone want to cover. What are some other good examples of this? Oh, kitnios. Kitnios is a good one actually. We could do kitnios as well. Right, kitnios. All right, so kitnios, swimming, and medicine. Yetz Hashem next Friday. Shkayach, everyone. A good night.